This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. My guest today is Harvard economist Jason Furman, who is one of Barack Obama's chief economic advisors and an architect of the Affordable Care Act. These days, he's in the news for his withering critique of Joe Biden's dismal economic record and his two-fisted attacks on Donald Trump's trade policy. We talk about Furman's defense of global markets, Obamacare's unfulfilled promises, and why he now thinks the national debt and AI are bigger deals than he used to believe. Here is the Reason Interview with Jason Furman. Jason Furman, thanks for talking to Reason.
Really excited to do so. Love reading you.
So you recently wrote a piece talking about the failure of Bidenomics and what you called the post-neoliberal delusion. Let's start with that. Irving Kristol famously said that a neoconservative is a liberal who got mugged by reality. What is a neoliberal, the way that you're defining that term?
Sometimes I think a neoliberal is like whatever I happen to think that somebody else disagrees with, and they bundle it all together. It's often defined more in the negative as an epithet. Right. If I had to do it in the positive, it is one, understands gains from trade, that when you have markets, when you have exchange, you can end up with more for everyone. Number two, respects a corollary, something that follows from that, that decentralized decisions can result in the best outcome. Now, you may want regulation or taxes to move them in a certain direction, and I might want more of those than you would want.
I suspect that's true.
Number three, that scarcity is at the heart of all interesting public policy problems, and so you have to respect trade-offs, budget constraints. At a macro level, that means you have to worry about the budget deficit. At a micro level, that means you have to do cost-benefit analysis. And finally, something that follows from all of that, that you don't have an automatic, easy answer to any question. You really have to sort of work through it, do the analysis, and figure it out. So there's some technocratic mindset associated with it as well.
You said that neoliberal is often invoked as a kind of term of derision or dismissal. And I think I'm right about this, correct me if I'm wrong, that it started being used in that way around the end of the 90s, after NAFTA had been passed, started by, I guess, Reagan, Bush, then, ultimately done by Clinton. And then at the end of the 90s, the beginning of the World Trade Organization. And this is when people who were interested in kind of increasing global trade and lowering tax or tariff barriers and things like that started to be called pejoratively neoliberals. Does that track?
That tracks, but it really exploded about a decade ago because there wasn't, at least on the Democratic side, a very well articulated alternative to it. And in some ways there isn't, but there are a set of them. Right. Modern monetary theory with deficits don't matter. Right. A neo-Brandeisian approach to antitrust that says big companies are presumptively bad.
Right, just bigness is a curse, and the fact that they're big means we should be thinking about breaking them up.
Yep. During the inflation debates, the focus on greed as a cause of inflation and stopping greed as a solution to inflation, and then people writing about industrial policy. So these are some different strands, but they all combine together in a rejection of a lot of those ideas of gains from trade, decentralization, the importance of taking trade-offs seriously.
So this is, you were in the Obama administration. This is a pretty lonely place you're occupying as somebody who identifies with the Democratic Party, right?
It's not totally lonely. President Obama put a lot of effort into negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a free trade agreement with our friends in the Pacific. He had a proposal that I spent a lot of time on corporate tax reform that would have lowered the corporate tax rate. He proposed 28%. At the time, it was 35%. And he was, I think, pretty sympathetic to the markets.
But Obama left office a decade ago. Right?
Sorry. At this point, it's mixed. It's not like people don't listen to economists. There's economists in government. There's economists in Fed. There's a lot of economists around. In the Biden administration, I would say the policy took a turn against this, and the rhetoric took a massive pivot against this. In some ways, the language turned even more than the policy did.
You would have been working with Joe Biden, in the Obama White House. Did you see it coming that his presidency was going to be as tilted towards kind of progressive concerns as opposed to kind of, market-friendly liberal concerns, or did that kind of blindside you?
It mostly blindsided me. Compared to Obama, Obama's quite cerebral, comes at things from the perspective of ideas and policy, may end up with a big dose of politics. He wouldn't have gotten where he was without that. Biden pretty much starts and ends with politics. And he has certain things he likes. He definitely likes labor unions quite a lot. So that part of it was not a surprise. But the degree to which he adopted, something that was much more towards the left within the Democratic Party, that did surprise me after he ran in the primaries as the centrist.
Why do you think the neoliberal consensus, and again, your article is called The Post-Neoliberal Delusion, why did that neoliberal coalition within the Democratic Party break down?
I don't know. There's one argument that it is, China entered the WTO, lots of suffering resulted, and there was a populist revolt in the form of Donald Trump, and you needed to listen to that and learn. I'm much less sure that that's the case. If you look at inequality in the 20 years after China entered the WTO, it actually went up much less than it did in the 20 years before China went to the WTO.
And most economists at this point, to the extent they talk about a China shock, it had kind of been absorbed, by around 2010 anyway.
Yes, you can debate the original China shock because there were definitely negative sides. There were also a bunch of positive sides. I think the positives outweighed the negatives. Regardless, everyone agreed it was basically over. I think it's also possible, and this is real speculation on my part, that there are ways in which the Democratic Party got culturally out of touch with Americans, that led to some backlash, and that was then misinterpreted and used as an argument for changing on economic policy.
What do you think the role of somebody like Bernie Sanders is in this, whether it's a rhetorical or a policy shift? He obviously, the fact that Hillary Clinton won, or rather Hillary Clinton lost in what should have been an easy win. I think that's a legitimate statement, but Sanders, clearly his insurgency in 2016 hurt her on some level. And is it then that, if Hillary may or may not have been a neoliberal the way you're talking about it, but Sanders definitely was not. He was anti-WTO, he was anti-trade, very pro-union, protectionist. Is that where some of the energy for rejection of neoliberalism in the Democratic Party comes from?
Look, I'm not a political expert. I'm a hobbyist. I pay a bit of attention.
Okay.
I have much more conviction around what I think is good for the world and bad for the world. And by the way, if you're governing and you do things that are good for the world, I think you get rewarded. For things that are bad for the world, you get punished. And we just saw that in the last election. But, I don't know. Americans are a strange mixture of contradictory views. I myself have a set of contradictory views. So you can tap into a sort of fear and loathing of billionaires, and every billionaire is a policy failure. But people can also laud and be thrilled about the things that billionaires invented and did and changed their lives, and understand that, and both of those together at once.
Yeah, I was on that point. Forbes, I guess, came out with its newest billionaires list, and Jerry Seinfeld is a billionaire now. And it's I don't think people think about Jerry Seinfeld and Elon Musk in the same category, but who has Jerry Seinfeld killed, right? Who has he harmed?
Yeah, Robert Nozick in his book had an example of Wilt Chamberlain. I do that in my class. I'm not sure they've all heard of Wilt Chamberlain, so I put Taylor.
Wilt Chamberlain, post Me Too. I don't know.
Right. I put Taylor Swift up on the screen, and did she make you better? I do say that I'm not endorsing her music. But did she make people worse off by becoming a billionaire, or did she make people better off, and in the course of that became a billionaire?
There, as you noted, there's a shift on the right also. Trump is post-neoliberal. He does not like global trade. He does not like kind of market forces. To some degree, he's more pro-business, I think, in a real way than Hillary, or then Hillary Clinton, Biden, or Kamala Harris might have been, but he's antagonistic towards the liberal project if we're talking about things like global trade and decentralized, open borders, open services, and things like that. Um, why, from an economic point of view, we're not talking politics here, the period of, in the post-war generally, but then since the collapse of the Soviet Union and since, the WTO was created at the beginning of this century, things have gotten better for the vast majority of people in America, on a material basis. Why then are people, why do they not see that? And why are they captivated by things like, stronger tariff policies and more protectionism?
Yeah. So first of all, on the premise of your question, I agree. President Trump, in some ways, is an even bigger rejection of anything resembling economic analysis, thinking about trade-offs, thinking about gains from trade and the like. And for the most part has eschewed any intellectual rationalization of it. There's some people out there like Oren Cass that provide some intellectual foundations for it, or attempt to provide some intellectual foundations for it. But for the most part, that's actually not what Donald Trump is interested in. They make a lot of noise. On the pro-business, in the wake of the tariff announcements, I thought it was striking how many people from the administration, including the Treasury Secretary, went out to talk down big business as a globalist project, as something for the elite. We don't care about the stock market. We don't care about the businesses. So they're pivoting pretty quickly away from business. So what's the commonality here? There's always the sense that things used to be better. And that if we could just get back to the golden age that's been a powerful thing throughout humanity. That siren song has been more powerful in the wake of financial crises. It's something you see. That's where populists often arise. And when Trump first rose, we weren't that far past a financial crisis. We've just had another type of enormous amount of dislocation in our country, both from COVID and through a set of extremely rapid cultural changes. And so I tend to blame that rather than looking at the statistics on median family income, which has grown quite strongly, or even wage inequality, which has actually fallen.
Yeah, and I mean, it grew under Trump, and then there's the COVID moment. And then after that, under Biden, real median household income, individual income all went up, which is a good sign. It's a sign that the economy is kind of delivering. But people aren't interested in that. When you said there have been radical or rapid social transformations, what do you mean?
I just meant, the Black Lives Matter movement, how rapidly things changed related to trans and the like. There was a sense that a lot of people in the country were being caught in a very big and very rapid set of changes.
When you're talking about the failure of Bidenomics, Biden spent a lot of money on a couple of big projects, or big spending bills. Can you talk about them and how they failed to deliver what he and his supporters claimed that they were going to do?
Yeah, let's just tick through 5 quickly. There's the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion. And the main thing we got from that was inflation. It's possible there was a slightly faster recovery, but the U.S. recovery wasn't actually much faster than any other place, at least in 2021 and into 2022. Second, student loan relief. This, to me, in many ways was the most egregious. This was done in August 2022. Inflation was raging. The deficit was high. Interest rates were high. And another $500 billion was poured on top of that without Congress authorizing that money in a way that I think is quite abusive of presidential authority. Third, infrastructure. Here I have a mixed view. I think it's a noble goal. I think it is a worthwhile goal, but it was accompanied with so many new rules and restraints on how the money would go out. Moreover, so much money was spent so quickly in an economy that was already overstretched that it ended up driving prices up rather than getting more infrastructure. That's where I think things like the abundance agenda are quite important, that are about building more stuff. Fourth is climate. Here, I like a lot of it. I would love a carbon tax. To me, that's the simple solution. I think libertarians should love that solution too.
Well, I think in principle they do, and then like when you start
Looking
at the politics, it gets dicier. But in any
Yeah.
case,
So that's
yeah.
what I'd love.
Yeah.
But, you can't pass one.
Right.
That's not Biden's fault. There was a combination of subsidizing the use of wind and electricity.
Mhm.
I think that's okay. Those use less carbon. But there was also a lot of remaking American industry. So we would make solar panels in the United States. That's where I get off the train. I'd rather just buy the cheapest ones from around the world. And finally, there's the CHIPS program, where from an economic perspective, I think we're going to get worse microchips and not create great jobs. National security and resilience, I think it will be a plus. And that plus outweighs, for me, the economic minus. I'm willing to pay a cost in terms of efficiency to have microchips made here, advanced ones, instead of all in Taiwan.
As long as they're more expensive and they're less good. But they're ours.
That's not my goal. Yeah, but I would say that about very few things.
Yeah.
But and that's where, again, the cost benefit comes into play. If you are willing to, if you tell me that you think your microchip plan is going to create more jobs and better jobs and increase economic growth, I'm not going to believe you.
Yeah.
If you come and tell me, you know what, it's going to cost some money, it's going to be a little bit inefficient, but here's what the national security benefit is, then we can go back and forth. How big is the economic cost? How big is the national security benefit? Is it worth it? Is it not?
Some of these programs, and there were some of them under Trump and under Biden when we're talking about COVID. Can you explain from an economic point of view? I'm a simple English major and a psychology major. Why is it bad when to tell people at a time like COVID, we're going to double or triple your unemployment benefits and extend them for long periods of time? Why does that end up having a bad effect on the economy?
Right. Well, if your goal is to get people not to work, and that might have been a goal in March and April of 2020, that's a perfectly fine way to do it. The policy lasted through September 2021. At that point, there were record job openings. People were either vaccinated or had caught COVID and were less susceptible to it again. And by that point, it really started to interfere with people getting back into work. I mean, why would you possibly want to work when you could get more money not working?
I think that almost every day until my retirement. I'm sure I'll be thinking that.
And then the second issue in the whole response is if you give people more money. Let's say we as a country were producing and buying and selling 1,000 a year, 1,000 units of whatever. You give people enough money to buy 1,100 at the same time that something's happened to the economy, so it can only make 900.
Right.
The result is you're not going to get more stuff. You're just going to get higher prices for the existing amount of stuff.
This is more dollars chasing the same number of goods. This is textbook inflation.
Yeah, exactly. So it made sense to protect people. Where you don't want your living standards to go way, way down because of COVID. But what we ended up doing was not doing the math and figuring out what you needed to do to protect people, not doing the targeting to get to the money to the people who needed it. And so the result was just much, much, much more money than we could possibly make in terms of stuff. And so it drove up the price of that stuff.
Where does it come from? I mean, has it always been this way that what you're saying is obvious, but then it became politically inexpedient to admit that, particularly when Biden was in office and this was happening, or when he was starting to run for president and then Harris. Is it just simply political posturing that Democrats are not going to admit that policies that their guys pursued, caused inflation? Just in the same way that Republicans won't admit it when, it's their guy in the dock.
I think there's a real problem with the way information is aggregated and transmitted. There were some people I know who, when that first stimulus bill were passed, who were emailing me, hey, this is really too large, but I don't want to undermine Biden by saying that. Or, this is too large, but I'm afraid people, or in the student loan case, this is a bad policy, but I don't want to get, destroyed the way, Jason, I saw you get destroyed on Twitter. Some people, though, don't even quite see that. So I've had people reach out to me who have said, hey, aren't the Trump tax cuts going to cause inflation, Jason? You should write about that. And I'm like, wait, weren't you the same person that a couple of years ago told me the Biden fiscal expansion wasn't causing inflation? Like, why does the fiscal impact on inflation depend on the political party of the person? And it's hard to think outside your own bubble and your own ecosystem. And all of this creates a sort of false sense of what it is people actually think when a lot of people aren't saying what they think. And some of those people are tenured professors who aren't going to be, in no risk of being fired.
I guess in a similar vein, we're hearing this now because Trump has levied tariffs. I mean, depending on what day of the week and when this airs, who knows what the case will be. But, currently he's suspended his tariffs or put them on ice for 90 days, except for China, et cetera. But you hear a lot of Republicans now saying, well, tariffs aren't taxes, and tariffs are paid for by the country that is sending goods, not the people who are importing them here in America. You recently wrote a piece in the New York Times saying that Trump's tariffs are based on an economic theory that makes no sense. Can you explain that? What is wrong with the tariffs the way that Trump is doing it?
Yeah, basically every step of Trump's mentality on trade is wrong. First of all, imports are good. They're a wonderful thing. We like to import coffee. We like to import cars. We like to import the inputs we need for American manufacturing. Second of all, trade deficits don't reflect other countries' tariffs and trade policies. There's countries with huge tariffs that run large trade deficits. There's countries with low tariffs that run trade surpluses. Third, our retaliation against them is going to shrink imports, but it's also going to shrink exports. And that hurts consumers. On the import side, it hurts American workers on the export side. And so just every step of his reasoning and fixation on trade deficits is just the wrong way to think about trade.
Is there, is there a consensus forming that either that's a bad policy, a kind of bipartisan or transpartisan consensus forming that, okay, these tariffs are not working and we're getting strong signals from global markets as well as, the things like the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones. But is there also a kind of transpartisan, coalition starting to say like, oh, maybe we should be more protectionist?
President Trump went so far that I think he discredited it for even many people on the protectionist side. So people like free trade, more than they ever did before now, more than they ever would after listening to me extol the benefits of free trade. So I don't think he's building that much of a coalition against it, but he has shifted the Overton window enormously. I mean, he did this initial reciprocal tariff announcement on Liberation Day. Then he took away.
You've lost. You're using his language, right? Do you call it the Gulf of America as well?
I don't care much about words. Maybe that's a mistake. Then he took away some of them, the so-called reciprocal part. So that left the United States with tariff rates that are the rates that prevail in Iran, Venezuela, and a bunch of other countries that aren't nearly as economically successful as Iran and Venezuela. So, and that's now become the reasonable, moderate, decent position. And so the Overton window has shifted quite a lot, and I'm not sure how we can shift it back.
Yeah. A place where your thinking has evolved over the years has to do with the role of debt and deficits in larger macroeconomic concerns. I think it was in 2019, you wrote a piece with Larry Summers, another Harvard grad and administration official back in the Clinton years, where you were kind of poo-pooing, debt. It's not that big a deal, and it should never really get in the way of doing what's right, in terms of helping the poor, et cetera. You have kind of revised some of that. Can you talk a little bit about where you are now and how you got to that position?
Yeah, so to say I've evolved on the debt is unfair. I've zigzagged on the debt.
Okay.
So I was concerned about it in the 90s.
Yeah.
Then I got increasingly less concerned about it. Then I got more concerned about it. I'd like to think that I'm following the data.
Right.
And when interest rates are low, we really could afford more debt. When interest rates are high, we can't afford more debt. It's possible my thinking has evolved and changed even subject to the
walk
data.
us through
But
that.
look, a world with 70% debt to GDP and a 2% interest rate is just very, very different from 100% debt to GDP and a 4.5% interest rate.
Why does large and persistent and growing national debt, and whether we're using debt held by the public or gross debt, which includes intergovernmental holdings, why, when that grows and particularly crosses the 90% or 100% of GDP threshold, why is that a problem?
So I don't know that we know what the threshold is.
Right.
Argentina had a massive financial crisis, including a fiscal crisis when it had debt of 45% of GDP.
Right.
The UK during I think it was the Napoleonic Wars, got as high as 250%. So it does depend on why you're borrowing. Do people trust your country? And the like.
Right. And it helps, the U.S., beyond everything else, because the dollar is the global reserve currency, we're working with different rules than, smaller countries.
Yeah, even than Germany or Canada.
Yeah.
They can borrow much less than we can. The first thing I'd say is if you were czar, or I was czar, or anyone was czar, there is just no way that your economic plan would be, we're going to spend at the current rate, tax at the current rate, and then make some large abrupt change 20 years in the future. You would rather make a smaller change now than a larger change in the future. And in economics, that's called tax smoothing. The consequence of not doing that is for sure we get less economic growth and we raise the chance of a fiscal crisis. And I don't know how high that chance is. But look, right now, I pay homeowners insurance against the risk that my house will burn down. The fact that my house didn't burn down last year, the year before, the year before that, doesn't mean I'm like a loser and a sucker for having bought this. I think of deficit reduction in some ways just like that.
Why does large and growing debt reduce economic growth?
It means the government is borrowing more money, which drives up interest rates. Driving up interest rates drives down business investment, drives down home building. The other way in which it matters is you might get out of that if you borrow from abroad to support your investment, but then your economic growth, you have to give it to those foreign countries to repay them for everything you borrowed. So either way, you're either doing less investment or you're having to repay foreigners if you want to maintain your investment.
This was during the fiscal crisis or the financial crisis or shortly after it. Carmen Reinhart, Vincent Reinhart, and Ken Rogoff wrote a paper, one version of which then they corrected, but it really said, as you approach a 90% debt to GDP ratio, that these episodes, they looked at a series of them over the past couple of hundred years, that it tended to reduce long-term economic growth, which for them it was about an average of 23 years of periods they called debt overhang. And it reduced growth in general from something like 3% annually to 2% annually, or like a 1% point. Does that sound about right to you? And does that help explain the sluggish economic growth that we've really been witnessing for a good part of the 21st century?
Take your second question first. I think the causation might go more the other direction, that there was a set of sluggishness either from slower productivity growth, from demography or whatever it was. And in order to keep the economy going, we needed the extra debt. And what's the evidence for that? We didn't, until 2021, get a lot of inflation. So through 2019, the problem was low inflation, not high inflation. That is generally indicative of demand being too low. So I don't think the debt was overheating our economy. I think it was making up for these problems. And that was part of why Larry and I thought we needed more debt. We overshot what we might possibly have imagined. In terms of the Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart's research, those papers were suggestive. There was a lot of correlation, not causation. So directionally, I think they're right. but I'm not convinced
Yeah.
about some nonlinear threshold.
In terms of dealing with debt and national debt and deficits, I mean, you now kind of propose we should be trying to balance the budget, which we've done in our lifetime. Certainly at the end
Balance
of the
the
Clinton
budget
years.
excluding interest payments.
Right.
So balance
Yeah.
what's called the primary
The
deficit.
primary deficit, and also invoking a kind of strict pay-go policy for, when we spend more or spend less. Can you describe, how pay-go would work and why that's important?
So I think pay-go is important for two reasons. It says that anything you do, you have to pay for. So you want to give money for student loan debt relief? Great. You can pass a law that costs $500 billion. You then need to raise taxes by $500 billion or cut spending by $500 billion. That has a macroeconomic rationale that when you're in a hole, you don't want to keep digging, and this stops you from digging. I think perhaps even more important, it lets you figure out whether the things you're doing are a good idea or not. Almost every idea that involves giving money to some group is a good idea until you ask where the money is coming from. If you can say, here's where the money's coming from, here's where the money is going, and on net, this is still a good idea, it's much more likely that this is a choice that's worth society making. But if you obfuscate that choice and you give the benefit to the people today for sure, and you give an uncertain cost that might even be even larger to people in the future, then I don't trust that we did the right social cost benefit to decide whether or not that idea was worth it.
Do you think there's any chance in hell that we're going to get back to a budgeting process? And, this is politics, but it stems from economics, that we'll get to a budgeting process where any of this is actually taken seriously.
I think there's three broad ways that we could get back to that, but I agree, maybe we don't. One is higher interest rates could really start to put pressure on politicians to take the debt more seriously. Even with the interest rate increases we've seen over the last couple of years, we're nowhere near the mortgage rates we had, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So higher interest rates, I think, would get people's attention. A second is there's what is really a political forcing event, which is the Social Security and Medicare trust funds get exhausted.
Yeah.
And there's no real economics there. The government could just pass a law saying ignore the trust fund, but it has a sort of magical significance, and that's a good thing, and we should want to hold on to that.
Yeah.
So that could force action. The third thing is just for whatever reason, voters could start to care more about it. In 1992, Ross Perot centered his third-party presidential bid around debt and deficit. In the last cycle...
And being anti-NAFTA.
And being anti-NAFTA. In the last cycle, RFK Jr. centered it around all sorts of things, but I don't remember the deficit being on his list.
Yeah. Do you think, maybe this is one of the limits of economics, but where does that, Ross Perot is kind of an alien who was, dropped onto the planet and starts talking about deficit. But other people talked about that. It was rhetorically, but how do voters get motivated to care about this rather than that? Because the past couple of years, we've spent a lot of time talking about stuff that seems pretty marginal to anybody's real life, but it happens.
Yeah, I'm never sure how much of these issues it's already out there in the electorate and a skilled politician discovers it, versus a skilled politician helps change people's mind and convince them that something is an issue. So I don't know which way the causation went. Did the people cause Ross Perot, or did Ross Perot cause the people? Yeah. Either way, Ross Perot did cause Bill Clinton to take deficit reduction and campaign on it more seriously, and resulted in him doing more deficit reduction than he probably otherwise would have done.
Yeah, and obviously it's also, he elected, or, he had 2 years where he pretty much got to do what he wanted, what his priorities were. Republicans were elected to majorities in the House and the Senate for the first time in decades. And that, by the end of the 90s, things had seemed to work out pretty well in terms of things like budget deficit.
Yeah.
And the end of the Cold War, so you could reduce defense spending and whatnot. Can you explain what's going on with the federal budget when we talk about things like in 2019, these are nominal dollars, we spent $4.4 trillion. 2020, COVID happens. It's 6.7 trillion. Um, it reduced to 2023 to 6.1 trillion dollars. We're currently on track to spend $7.2 trillion. We're years past COVID. Like, what are we spending so much more on?
Well, you clearly like large numbers more than
Yeah.
I do, because I just divide everything by GDP and do it all
Right.
as a share of GDP.
Okay. Yeah.
Spending has increased some as a share of
Yeah.
GDP. One of the biggest things that increased as a share of GDP is interest on the debt.
Right.
And that, by the way, is, in some sense, it's technically spending, but it's the consequence of taxes being lower than spending. So tax cuts increase interest and spending increase interest. If you look at the non-interest spending, entitlement growth is the things that have been growing, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. With Medicare, the growth has actually been much slower than people were counting on and hasn't been that rapid. But Medicaid is covering a lot more people than it was a few years ago. I probably actually think that's a good thing.
Well, as one of the architects of Obamacare, you would like that because Medicaid is one of the primary ways that more people got covered.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then the goal there was to expand marketplaces, but it ended up the marketplaces went up a little bit and Medicaid went up quite a lot. And, is that the perfect health system to have in our country? Probably not.
Yeah.
Do I think this is a different category of service? Yeah. I mean, unless you as a society are willing to let the person lie outside the hospital, dying of whatever it is, and not treat them, we want to have some explicit form of care rather than rely on a patchwork of, bad debt that hospitals are forgiving.
How do how do we get any kind of handle on things like Social Security? And Medicare will, at various points, start to grow as well, faster than it has been. What is your preferred solution to deal with entitlement problems?
So if I had to write it on a specific Social Security plan, I would, for example, extend the payroll tax to cover health insurance. That would bring in a lot of additional revenue. It would do it in a reasonably efficient and non-distorting
By that,
manner.
you mean just lose
the employer contribution to health insurance. You would lose the exclusion
Okay.
for it. So you'd get more revenue in.
Right. And so it would be, John McCain actually talked about this in 2000.
He talked about it for income taxes, so I just said it for payroll taxes on Social Security, but same type of idea.
Yeah.
I had written about it at the time. I think that's a good idea. You have to worry about, does it undermine the employer system? But as long as you have other systems, I don't worry about that as much. I would then take steps that would cut Social Security benefits from their current growth path for, say, the top 1/3 of beneficiaries. Doing more of that with the retirement age, both delaying when you can start getting benefits, which has been at 62 for a very long time, and the normal benefit age. And then there's a bunch of other changes you could make. And I would even strengthen, what they do to reduce poverty. So, but these are all sort of different tweaks. And
so you're not in for radical rethinking of, say, of Social Security, which is kind of a bad deal for most people. I mean, for lower income people, it's a good deal, but for other people, it's kind of, it's a force, or it's taken out in taxes, and then you get a bad return on it. So
most of that bad return comes from the fact that we already gave benefits to a lot of people in the past.
Right.
And so if you switch to a new system now, unless you are willing to say for 25 years, we're just going to not pay any Social Security benefits, then you get a good deal. If the new people are putting money in private accounts, plus they're paying for the first generation of retirees, once you take that adjustment into account, you're not actually getting much of a better deal out of it. So largely, I would tweak the existing structure. If accounts are important to you, making them an add-on account that adds on to the existing system. And if you do that, you could do more benefit cuts and maintain people's retirement security. That's broadly what I would do. From a process perspective, though, I really do think this is a sort of old saying that people say. It needs to be bipartisan. If you look at the options, the tax-only options are really unappealing.
Right.
The spending-only options are really unappealing. Neither party is going to want to do this on their own. There are a set of, by the way, gimmick options. We'll transfer general revenue There's proposals to let the government borrow money and invest that money in stocks
That sounds like a great idea.
leverage it all
Yeah.
up. So there's a bunch of gimmicks, but anything that's real, it requires pain. Anything that requires pain, both parties need to be involved with.
I want to talk about your kind of evolution, if we can use that term, on AI in a second. But has any of the kind of developments since you left the Obama administration, has any of that shaken your faith in a kind of Keynesian economics? Maybe not a pure Keynesian economics, but the idea that the government should be managing overall supply or demand, in terms of, as a kind of counter-cyclical intervention to, what's going on in the economy.
So as an economic matter, nothing has shaken my faith in a Keynesian approach. In fact, if anything, I think we've seen that it really can make quite a big difference, both monetary and fiscal policy. At the level of politics and human decision-making, I'm now less enamored by the expertise and genius of our Congress.
Yeah.
And also the Fed, I think, has done on balance a good job, but there have been times I think it has gotten things quite wrong.
Does it
And
generally get things wrong by keeping interest rates low or
that
letting them
is
go too high?
The error of recent years has been
Yeah.
on
And
interest
this,
rates on the low
when
side.
we're talking like recent years, we're really talking what, about like 30 or 35
No, I mean, we
years?
didn't have high inflation prior to 2020. So really
Okay.
since 2020
All right.
is where they kept interest rates too low. So what does this lead me to? So I think monetary and fiscal policy really matter, and just the way John Maynard Keynes
Yeah.
was sketching out.
Mhm.
But I think people often misapply them. So that means I would like more rules.
Mhm.
Automatic fiscal rules. The unemployment rate goes up, money goes out.
Yeah.
The unemployment rate comes down, money comes back. Same thing with interest rates, basically a formula to set interest rates. Now with interest rates, I would not hand monetary policy over to ChatGPT. I don't think
Right.
it's quite good enough to do it yet. But what I would do is have the Fed chair, every time they do something different from what the formula said, get up there and say, here's what the formula said to do. Here is why I went out and chose to do something different than that formula. So you'd make it more of the default. So I have now more sympathy for policy rules.
And
than I used to.
is that coming kind of out of a Friedmanist monetarist, or maybe not monetarism per se, but the idea of having predictable default rules then, and if you deviate from them, you've got to explain why.
Yeah. And Milton Friedman had one for the growth of the money supply. That's not one that I think really anyone supports anymore, because the relationship between the money supply and both inflation and output really broke down. But John Taylor, who's in some ways an heir to Milton Friedman, he came up with the Taylor rule. And for a long time, Republicans were like, hey, this is the thing you should do. Democrats were saying, they're so wise. Why would they want to listen to this rule? It's much better to listen to their wisdom.
Yeah.
I now have a little bit of the conservative understanding and skepticism of the wisdom, even of the very best experts.
Yeah.
And that says a dumb formula, isn't perfect, but it probably is at least less biased and systematic errors than you might get from people.
Why did you become an economist?
I really liked math and a logical way of thinking at the world, but I really cared about all the issues that we're talking about now. I mean, I wrote an article in my high school newspaper about the budget deficit, and I haven't found a copy of that. I'd love to find what I wrote.
Were you for it or against it?
Whatever it is, I've changed my view since that article many times.
All right.
Since then. So I really like this set of issues, but I liked being able to think about them in a logical and rigorous way, and economics let me do that.
Do you feel like economics as as an academic discipline, is it becoming more and more tainted by politics and ideology, or is that just a wrong way to think about things?
If you go to an economics seminar, there is a huge premium on coming up with novel and counterintuitive ideas. Somebody comes up with a conclusion that you like. You don't want to applaud them. You want to point out some really stupid mistake that they made and have everyone think you're smart. So I think the process of refereeing, of debate, et cetera, is healthier than it is in most of the social sciences or in all of the social sciences. That being said, if you look under the age of 50 in the economics profession, most people are on the left. They're not on the right. And that does affect the questions that people ask, the moral approach that underpins their work, and maybe the amount of effort they put into trying to find errors and things. So I would love an intellectual ecosystem in economics that was more ideologically balanced than what we have now. I don't think it's terrible. There's certainly not discrimination. A lot of the key institutions are run by people that are older and that actually are Republican. But I think we'll get better answers to the questions we care about with people coming at it from different perspectives. And the main different perspective that we're missing is one that's skeptical of government, skeptical of the wisdom of the people turning the knobs and dials.
Where does that kind of change come from? There's groups like Heterodox Academy, which is trying to create ideological diversity among faculty. How does that happen? Is it essentially through hiring practices or?
Yeah, look, people talk about disparate treatment where you have discrimination against a group. You don't want to hire a conservative.
Right.
I think that might be true in some departments. I don't think it's true in economics. Then there's disparate impact where you just end up with different ratios.
Right.
When you have disparate impact, the first step is to just be aware of it. And then maybe at every stage you might find something. In history, for example, if you went out and rather than hiring someone to do sort of ethnic studies, you hired someone to do military history, and you made your military history search completely non-ideological, you're more likely to pick up someone from the conservative side advertising for that job than a different type of job. So it's the types of questions you ask is part of it. In the economics of crime, how much are you studying the problems that police cause with the way they police? How much are you studying the problems that crime cause for the people that are victims of crime? So, what research gets funded, for example? It's much easier to get funded studying problems that face girls than problems that face boys. Richard Reeves has done a great job of highlighting the problems that face boys. Maybe the funders will start to listen and fund research on that problem.
Let's talk about AI, because this is a place where a few years ago you wrote, I don't think AI is going to be that big a deal, that it's going to be a kind of technological improvement that will be kind of rolled out and won't be that disruptive. Now you seem to be much more bullish on AI. Can you explain why?
Yeah. So first of all, I still have the same view I had before, which is our core problem we have now is that we have too little AI, not too much. Productivity growth in some ways is a measure of how many things people used to do that machines can now do. And it's not nearly high enough. I'd like to see it much higher. So the biggest problem we have is how to have more AI. On the disruptive side in terms of jobs, I also continue to think that AI is going to make new types of jobs, that it's only going to replace parts of some types of jobs, that it's going to make us richer, so we're going to want to consume more services and all of that. So, in broad strokes, I still think the same thing. I'm just much more optimistic, and I'm much more optimistic because they made breakthroughs at a pace that a lot of the experts in this area didn't think they would. There's still a question of how that gets adapted and used in the workplace, how long that process takes. So I've shifted towards a more positive direction.
Because there's more of it and it seems to be speeding up.
Yeah. Now, another piece, though, of AI that I think has been really interesting to me is how you think about the digital giants and how concerned are you about competition in the digital space. I continue to be concerned. I think antitrust enforcement is important so that because I think competition is the source of innovation. But what's really surprised me is that the existing incumbents weren't the ones that were able to dominate in AI.
Why does that surprise you, though? Isn't that always the case? That Microsoft comes along and knocks off IBM, even as they have a kind of complementary relationship with them and whatnot.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. It's happened over and over and over again. So maybe this is like the opposite of Lucy and the football or something. But my worry was that we were in a place where AI depended so much on data and so much on scale, and that nobody other than Google and Facebook, Meta would have that scale and those resources. And instead, what we've seen is it turns out that the algorithm matters a lot too. Yeah. And so OpenAI and Anthropic and Perplexity, came to some degree from nowhere. They got
Right.
funding from some of the big companies. DeepSeek came from even less,
Yeah.
although probably more than they claimed.
Does that give you pause about like, oh, the Chinese communists are going to somehow be running everything?
On AI, I think there's some motivation that comes from geopolitics, but boy, is it hard to contain innovations there. And on foundational models, it's hard to be more than 6 months ahead of the next person. And so, microchips is much easier to maintain, a 5-10 year lead on than it is on, on these algorithms.
As a final question, talking about AI and, the fear that, we're going to wake up tomorrow and, whole industries will be gone and there won't be any jobs left for certain types of people. Your former boss, Barack Obama, famously talked about how ATMs had, wiped out bank teller jobs. This is a kind of classic example of where people think of technology as something that robs people of work, whereas that certainly is not the case even in the retail banking industry. Why are we prone to that error again and again? That a new technology that actually makes things more productive is going to put people out of work.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think you got it right. But what Obama said is people expected ATM to take teller jobs, but instead we ended up with more bank branches because of ATMs, and so you ended up with more bank tellers, not
or
less.
people in the banking industry.
Yeah. So, we have hundreds of years of experience with this. No one could have imagined what would happen in a world where most people weren't working on farms. What'll they all do? What else is there to do other than
they'll
make
go to
food?
Factories, but now they're not in factories. Where have they gone?
Right. So just our imagination isn't that great, but it also doesn't need to be that great because that's the beauty of the market. Everyone's out there, the businesses, the individuals trying to find new things, trying to start a new business, trying to figure out a new job. And the central planners don't figure that out. It's sort of a Hayekian spontaneous order, and it's worked out pretty well for a long time now. So that would be my best guess going forward.
So it will, but then is there a stronger argument to say to people that like, hey, in the past it all worked out, or trust the Hayekian extended order and decentralization?
Well, look. There's also disruption. I mean, the Luddites weren't wrong. These machines were bad for the Luddites. They were good for society as a whole, but not for them. And so part of why people are nervous is because they don't understand what's going to happen. And if only somebody could explain it to them, they'd be thrilled. Part of why they're nervous is because they do understand, and they understand that it won't be good for them. And, it's hard to make the longer term positive sum case for the world, but if you constantly make whatever decision is loss minimizing over the next minute, but has costs that grow over time, you'll end up more like Argentina over time and less like the United States.
Okay, well, without getting into a discussion of Javier Milei, who's remaking Argentina, we're going to leave it there. Jason Furman, thanks for talking to Reason.
It's been great talking to you.